Welcome back. Bob here for the Old Iron Lover channel, and we're about to embark on another mini-series. This one here is a build for a bending brake, and it kind of started with the reason I got into this in the first place was restoring antique engines and tractors, things like that, and I wanted to have a way to make the gas tanks and the coolant tanks and things like that. I found an article by name of a guy named Glenn Wilson in an old hobby machining magazine. I don't remember what the name of it was, but he had designed what was a pretty nice looking bending brake. It was only basically 18 inches wide, and I wanted something big enough to make some big cooling tanks. I actually have a sample here. This is a coolant tank. It's a tank cooled engine. This is basically the radiator for it. It's for a Stover DV2 from the 1930s. It's seen better days. I have a sheet metal roller so I can roll this roll a tube out of new steel. I've got a bead roller so I can put a wire reinforcement around the edge and all that. But I don't have any way of making the seam, so I thought I would put a little bend in the end of a couple of pieces, or the couple ends of the piece of sheet metal, and make a seam that I can solder shut. Had no way to make a neat seam, so this was kind of the first piece of hardware I was going to make, a new tool. And I got a couple other gas tanks and these two more gas tanks to make, and possibly some other stuff. And I figured, why not just go ahead and start making these things instead of sending them out and waiting for months for somebody to custom make them for me. And I guess I can make, who knows what, iron shoe boxes with or something. Anyway, here's this pile of iron here. I've collected some good part of it out of my iron warehouse I have in the other room, and some of it I actually just ordered. Somewhere in all this pile of iron we're going to find a bending brake. There's a bunch of steel, there's a piece of brass for some bushings. This is a base I actually started working on off of a plan in a book magazine, an old Popular Mechanics I think it was. For one, it was a very simple one, and this was going to be the base, and I think there's another piece in there I was going to use for the leaf, the folding leaf. And but it was pretty simple. It was one of those things where you put a piece of steel on top of your sheet metal and clamp it down, and then bend it with a couple of hardware hinges on the leaf. This one's a lot nicer, the one we're going to go now. We're using Glenn's original design, but I'm making it longer, which is going to change some of the pieces, the design of the thing in a couple of places. The design is very sturdy. He says it's good for 14 gauge, I think, easily. Anyway, this is kind of the introduction to the project. This piece here was going to be the base. I've already welded on a couple of pieces that Glenn suggested in his article. If I find, remember that article where I got it from, or what I actually did is I researched it. I couldn't find a reprint, but I did find a book that had 2 years worth of projects out of a metalworking magazine. I don't remember the name. And I think there was a series of 6 of these books. And this one was from 1990 and 1991. And I hunted around till I got a good deal on the book, and they're out there. I think it's worthwhile if you're interested in this stuff to actually buy the book. And you may be able to get a hold of the publisher if I can find it, and get maybe they'll make you a reprint or something. I don't know how the copyright laws are going to get into that, but I know people are fairly picky about that, so I'd rather buy it than go copy a book. So anyway, what little welding on it needs to be done is done. This is the only part that had any welding on it. When I get all done, this thing's going to be heavy. There's a couple of 100 pounds of iron on this cart. So kind of end this part of it and start with episode 1, and we'll be working on the base, and then we'll work on the leaf, and then the big complicated part is the adjustable clamps and the finger brakes, so making all the fingers and all that, and the clamps are adjustable for the setback for different thicknesses of sheet metal, so you'd be further toward the bending leaf for a thin piece and further back for a thicker piece. And I think it also has some other adjustments for the amount of tension on it and all that. So you'll see all this when we get it together. The side pieces that have all this adjustments and the bushings and bearings and pivots and all that stuff is pretty much the same as what what Glenn had written up in his article. And the longer pieces and the fingers and that kind of stuff will be something we've modified from that. So thanks for watching, and we will come back as soon as we get another interesting piece put together. The original idea for this came from an article by Glenn Wilson in a magazine published in 1990. The name of the article, or the name of the publication, was Projects in Metal, and I'll put the details in the description of this. The article is reproduced by the publisher in a book that actually it's a series of books, but this is volume 2 of the book of the series that had all the articles, or selected articles from 1990 and 1991. Each of the 6 books covers 2 years, and some of them are available from the publisher and some of them are not, but you can find them online. I'm not in a position to make free copies because I don't have a license to do so, and I don't want to get into
Anyway,
let's go in and take a look at this thing and see how what the features are, how it functions, and so forth. So the reason I chose this in the first place is it was kind of flexible as to how you use it. You don't have to have everything absolutely perfect for a particular size of sheet metal and then not have it work very well for something that's thicker or thinner. So it's got some adjustments on it that are kind of nice. So there's a base plate and a bending leaf. The base plate has a couple of pieces attached to it. This front piece is the pivot for the bending brake, the bending leaf, and it's also a mounting point for this linkage here. This piece, this is actually a turnbuckle that adjusts the height of this end of this clamping lever. The clamping lever has a clamping bar on it, and it's drilled and tapped so you can mount the fingers on it. This lever here brings the front of the clamp lever down, which brings the finger down and clamps the sheet metal into the bending brake. Excuse me. The turnbuckle is used to adjust the initial position of this linkage, and it kind of serves 2 purposes. It gets you at about a 45-degree angle, but it also gets the height adjustment so that when you have it in this position, it's clamped. When you have it in the release position, there's a gap underneath here that's big enough to slide a piece of sheet metal under it. And that adjustment is a fairly fine adjustment. The other thing I liked about it is it starts out when you're building this, the the gap between the front edge of the finger and the beginning of the bending brake, or the bending leaf, is very small for a very thin piece of sheet metal. And that's the position this back lever is in. And by the way, this operates off of a cam. This is this shaft is actually a cam, and the eye on the other end of this turnbuckle just moves up and down with the rotation of the cam. This back piece here is also a cam that moves this the bottom end of this lever forward and backward. It moves it up and down a little too, but the purpose of it is to move back into the backward position, like so. It pulls that finger back so you can accommodate a little thicker piece of steel. And one of the things I like about it too, and this is accomplished different ways on different bending brakes, but when you're working with it, you get into a position where you have something bent, and there's not an easy way to stuff it underneath the bar and get it under the fingers again. So you can, these aren't really tied in at all, they just sort of slide out. This is the cam that runs the clamping, and then this whole thing will just swing up out of the way, and you can do whatever you need to do and drop it back in. Fairly straightforward. This particular bending brake is twice as wide as the one in the article, and that presents a number of problems. One is if you're out of square with anything, it's going to amplify it. The original one's about 15 inches wide. Mine is 30 inches wide because I needed something that big. This is not going to, it's the effect of having, say, the side of this not exactly perpendicular to the top. Is going to amplify twice as much when you get to the other end and cause potential for some binding. So I wound up, when I fitted all these pieces, I had to actually dress this edge just a little bit to get things squared up enough to reduce the binding in it. The other thing is, this bending leaf is a piece of 1/2 inch steel, and I didn't really anticipate that it would flex as much as it did when I'm bending some steel or sheet metal, but it did. So I added a 1 inch square bar to the bottom of it to tie it all down, or to stiffen it so it wouldn't get any flex in here. And the first time I used it without that bar in there, I had a piece of 16 gauge in there, which is probably a little stiff for this wide a bend, but it gapped out a good 1/8 of an inch and made kind of a sloppy bend. So added that piece. When I got it together, I noticed that there's a little bit of interference here. You can bend it up a little past 90, and I thought, well, I'll get as much as I can, and I beveled the piece, this plate hanger for the bending leaf, just to give myself that little bit more. It didn't really add a whole lot, but the other thing is that the original project called for this base plate to be probably close to 1/2 as wide, but I had a piece already out, and I was going to use it on a much simpler bending brake, and I never got around to it, so I didn't cut it back. I just left the whole thing there. Building tips. Study the original article. If you're going to build one of these, definitely get your hands on a copy of the original article. Read up on it. Look at, read it pretty carefully. See exactly how this thing goes together. It makes a big difference in understanding what is critical, what isn't, how it works, what's supposed to happen when you move the levers and so forth. Other problem I ran into was a lot of my steel, all my steel was hot rolled and it had mill scale on it. And I wanted it to be, a nice looking project, so I cleaned the scale off of both sides of it and the ends and the edges and everything. And I found that the dimensions that were in the original project for the steel I had, by the time I got the scale removed, the thickness of the base plate, the bending leaf, the fingers, a few other things, it was just a little narrower, a little thinner than what it was specified. And that causes some problems. You really got to think that through. For instance, they look for a certain width of there's a slot on each of these three pieces. There's a slot that straddles the edge of the base or the bending leaf, and that slot, the elevation of that slot is real important to line everything up. Well, my steel's a hair thinner, and so I couldn't make the slot as wide. So I had to be sure that when I put the slot in these, that I registered the bottom of the top of the slot. In other words, this right in here, the piece that sits on top of the base plate or the leaf, and got it lined up exactly how the geometry is supposed to be, and didn't worry too much about the bottom. I just made it whatever it needed to be to straddle the plate. And if I'd have done anything different, everything would have been off vertically. When you put it together, this piece is kind of the last thing you put on. You get everything else all together, even to the point of having a starting point for your fingers. It's kind of a juggling act back and forth. You get things adjusted pretty well, and then what I did is I just put a big old long clamp on this and just clamped these onto the side, just hold it in place. Played with the adjustment, saw what it did, and the article even says what you're supposed to do is slide this forward and backward until you get the geometry right here. But when you slide it backwards, then it changes some of the geometry here, and you gotta adjust the turnbuckle a little more or whatever, and then that makes you move this a little bit more to get it back where you want it. You should test it with a piece of whatever size sheet metal you plan on using, and number 25 or 26 or 22 or something in there, so you can raise it enough to get it in and out. It clamps good when you get it down. You get it as close as you can. You're going to juggle back and forth between the position of this and this turnbuckle adjustment. There's no way around it. So just be prepared for that. If you're going to make yours longer than the original plan, I would recommend you make it as short as you can and still do what you want to do. So if it doesn't need to be 30 inches long, you only need 20, well, I would only make it 20. I mean, it's up to you. But I will tell you that the longer it is, the more touchy everything is going to be. As far as the angles, I mean, everything, the squareness and all that, things are going to start binding the longer it gets, and it's going to be more work to fix it. Specifically, watch everything around the squareness of the ends here. The squareness the front edge versus the sides, and the top versus the sides. Same thing with the bending leaf. They need to be pretty darn square. Like I say, the longer you make it, the more that's going to amplify any problems you have on the ends. So I'm going to splice in a little video here. I actually made a little project with it. I'm going to show you the final project, and then we'll see. Well, the project I chose to try this thing out with was, rack to hold all the fingers and the mounting screws and everything all in one place. Actually, it seemed like every time I moved one of them, I slid it off the bench and dropped it, and I wound up having to dress the corners back up. So anyway, it came out pretty good considering the high level of amateurness I have when it comes to doing sheet metal work. Got a couple of things I got to finish on it. I haven't quite decided how I want to do the handle. The one that they suggest is kind of a clumsy looking thing. It's a forks over there and has a screw to clamp it down. It's a sort of a Y with a slit in it, and it just compresses that slit so it binds on the edge of the lip here. But it does have the potential of kind of getting in the way. I was thinking about mounting a couple of handles on the bottom and then bringing them out so they're up here out of the way. I think I'm going to, I haven't run into a problem with it, but I think I will anyway, drill a couple holes in this block. Let me move the camera down a little bit. So up under here is another big bar that forms the front of the frame for this. I'm going to drill up under it a couple of holes and tap them for some mounting screws. So you can bolt them up from the bottom of a bench. And I thought, maybe offset a little bit from it, I'd put a couple T-slots in there too. So if I wanted to put a carriage bolt, or a pair of carriage bolts in from the top of a bench and just push them up and slide them into the slot, it might be easier than chasing a screw around, trying to thread it into this thing. It's not particularly light. There's a couple of modifications that might consider at some point in time. One of them would be to figure a way to take this linkage and move it outboard so it's outside these instead of inside these, and that would move this clamp lever out and make the clamp a little longer, but it would also keep this interference from happening here. It'd give you a little more room to get a better bend. And I think that's about all. I didn't have a lot of trouble getting the binds out of it. I just did, addressed a few things. But one possibility, I hadn't really thought much about it, but do we get a couple of small self-centering bearings on each of these plates to allow it to line itself up? So anyway, really enjoyed the project. It's quite a lengthy one. I will be putting up more videos on the actual construction and everything of it. There'll be several of these. That's coming down the road. After the bash, I'll start on that. So also, like I say, I'll splice in a video where I kind of fast forwarded through making this project right here. And thank you for watching, and subscribe if you like it, and if you are headed out to the summer bash at Bar Z in Rancho Cucamonga in California, I'll see you there.